Welcome to the Hazmat Files, the podcast where science meets safety. I'm your host, Erica Fisher, and today we're diving into a topic that's as volatile as it is vital: monomers, polymers, and the hidden hazards of polymerization. Whether you're a seasoned hazmat responder or just curious about the chemistry behind everyday materials, this episode will unpack the reactive nature of monomers, the stability of polymers, and the critical role first responders play when things go wrong. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Transcare or its sponsoring organizations. The content provided is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal or professional advice. Today I'm joined by Keith Silverman and Pete Kirk, experts in chemical safety and emergency response. Pete Kirk has worked at Dow Chemical since 1990, where he currently serves as the North American Emergency Services and Security Operations Leader. A U.S. Army veteran who served in Operation Desert Storm, Pete holds a criminal justice degree from Saginaw Valley State University and has held multiple roles in Dow's Emergency Services and Security Department. He's also a certified firefighter, EMTB, and hazmat technician who teaches across the U.S., and he lives in Midland, Michigan with his wife, Lisa. They have 2 sons. Dr. Keith Silverman is a seasoned expert in hazardous materials and emergency response, with over 30 years of experience in incident management across the chemical industry. He's a certified firefighter, fire inspector, and instructor who volunteers with the Somerset, New Jersey Fire and Rescue Department and teaches at the Somerset County Emergency Services Training Academy. Keith previously served as Chief Operations Officer for a specialty chemical company and has held several leadership roles with the Transcare Executive Committee and the IAFC Hazardous Materials Committee. Let's start with the basics. Monomers and polymers may sound like textbook terms, but understanding their difference is crucial for anyone in the field. Keith, can you kick us off with the breakdown of what monomers are, how they behave, and why they pose unique risks compared to the polymer counterparts?
Hi, Erica. Thanks for having us on. Sure, let me start with monomers. So monomers are molecules, basically, that get bonded to each other or to other molecules to form a larger molecule or a polymer. So essentially, monomers are the building blocks of polymers. Monomers can be hazardous, such as they may be flammable, they may be volatile, they may be corrosive, but most importantly, monomers are reactive. That's what makes them monomers. So because they're reactive, they're prone to spontaneous polymerization, especially if they're exposed to heat, light, or contaminants. In the chemical industry, polymers are made from monomers in what we call specialized chemical reactors. These newly formed polymers are more chemically stable than monomers, and they're safe to use and handle. Polymers themselves, though, may still pose a hazard if they're burning in a fire, or they may produce toxic smoke, or they may melt, things like that. Polymers are everywhere in our lives. Some common polymers are things such as starch, cellulose, plastic, paints. Some polymers that we make are actually the finished product, which gets packaged and sold to consumers. But other polymers are used to manufacture other products, or they may be polymers that are used to make other polymers. For example, paints and coatings are liquid polymer that harden when exposed to air.
Good morning, Erica. Thanks for having me also. This is Pete and with my colleague Keith. And just to add to that, monomers are raw materials that are used to make up the polymers, and a large amount of them are plastics, the polymers. And to Keith's point, they generally have vastly different hazards associated with them. Similar to how mixing chlorine gas with explosive and dangerous sodium metal results in a material that is safe to eat, table salt, right? Polymerization of toxic and flammable and corrosive monomers turns them into polymers that are safe enough to use in medical implants or to store your food in takeout containers. We use these polymers in everyday life, from your car to your phone to toothbrushes are made of polymers. And to Keith's point, the paints and coatings and just almost everything you see in today's world has some type of polymer used to make it. Monomers are generally highly reactive, as Keith has said. Most are flammable, and they can have varying toxicity, while polymers are generally non-reactive, non-toxic, inert materials that only burn when they're placed in a fire. It's important to note that there's two kinds of materials called monomers, ones that react with themselves to form chains. These are your vinyl monomers, your acrylates, and a group called styrenics. If you ever hear that term, it's just a term for a group of polymers that are based on the monomer styrene. Examples are polystyrene, acrylonitrile butadiene styrene, which is ABS products, styrene butadiene rubber, SBR, and ones that react with other materials to form chains are ethylene oxide, formaldehydes, isocyanates, epoxies. The first type is shipped with inhibitors to prevent that polymerization with themselves. The second type does not have the inhibitors.
Now that you both have helped lay the groundwork, let's talk about real-world encounters. First responders don't deal with chemistry in a vacuum. They face it in rail cars, warehouses, and other transport vessels. Keith, what are some common monomers that first responders might encounter during hazmat incidents?
Some common monomers we find out there are things like styrene. Peter mentioned it before. Styrene's used to make a lot of different polymers. Vinyl chlorides, acrylic acid, and different types of acrylic acid, such as methacrylic acid, which we call MAA, or ethyl methacrylic acid, EMA. Find that in nail polishes and other polymers like that. Ethylene oxide is another very common monomer that's used to make a lot of things and used to join a lot of chemicals together. And isocyanates, diisocyanates also is used as a lot of cross-linking in polymers.
So we know what monomers are and where they show up, but what happens when they start reacting? Pete, can you explain what polymerization actually is?
To put it simply, polymerization is the process of a monomer reacting with itself over and over to form long chains. It's forming a polymer, right? An end product. Critically important here is that most chemicals will only react with other materials, so they require inadvertent mixing with another material to create that reaction hazard. Monomers, on the other hand, they react with themselves, meaning that they have everything brought to the party ready to react at any time. They don't need another material for that reaction to occur. Some monomers have all the energy they need to react stored right in their chemical structure. Under the right conditions, the monomers begin to self-react. The reaction produces energy, and that energy is used to keep the reaction going. While mixing with other materials can be a source of reaction initiation for monomers, it is not necessary for them to polymerize. To prevent monomers from turning into these polymers, we add a tiny amount of a material called polymerization inhibitor. It's a different inhibitor for the specific kind of monomer that you're dealing with, that you're shipping. But this inhibitor will help keep it safe and stable during transportation and storage, as long as that storage conforms to not excessive heat storage, not excessive time.
And Keith, polymerization can be done in special reactors. Can you describe what makes these reactors different from standard tanks and how they help manage this reaction safely?
Sure. So, as we mentioned a few times already, polymerization reactions join monomers. And when they join them, these reactions are highly exothermic, or they release heat. And in some cases, they release a lot of heat. And when you increase the temperature inside a container, you also always increase the pressure. Increase temperature, increase pressure. This is a principle in chemistry and physics. So what we need to do when we're making polymers is remove the heat from the reactors, or else the temperature could keep increasing. It could get too hot, and then we could have a runaway or uncontrolled polymerization reaction. To do this, we use coolant systems around the reactors. They wrap around the reactors. Sometimes the pipes run inside the reactors. They're just like the ones in a car's engine, and they're used to take the excess heat out of the reaction. If there's a cooling issue during a polymerization reaction, or if a polymerization reaction takes place outside of a reactor, say in a drum or a container or a tank car, we're going to see it more of an uncontrolled polymerization reaction then, because there's no way to take away that excess heat. There's no cooling mechanism there. And then sometimes we get that uncontrolled polymerization reaction, or sometimes people will call it a thermal runaway. In chemical reactors, we design them and engineer them for the temperatures and pressures that we're going to expect during the reaction. And we build a lot of safety features into them. There's the cooling jackets, there's mixing so we get even heating, there's pressure relief devices to relieve excess pressure, and there's also emergency quench systems we can use to sometimes shut down the reaction. But as you mentioned, it's very important to remember that chemical reactors are not tanks. Tanks are engineered to just store chemicals. They're not made for those excessive temperatures. They're not made for those excessive pressures. So they're not designed for chemical reactions to take place in them. So while they can hold chemicals safely, if we get unwanted or uncontrolled chemical reactions like a polymerization reaction happening in a tank, then we could have issues with that container.
And one of the unsung heroes in chemical safety is the inhibitor, which we've mentioned. Let's explore how these tiny molecules help keep big problems at bay. Because when inhibitors run out, the clock starts ticking. Pete, what should first responders know about their function and failure?
Inhibitor failure is definitely something that we need to be concerned about in the transportation of the monomers. Monomers are often stabilized with these inhibitors, and it's different inhibitors for the specific monomers, but not all have inhibitors in them, but most do. If those fail, spontaneous polymerization can occur. Inhibitors are your primary line of defense against the polymerization incident. It's the primary thing the industry that ships monomers relies on to keep the monomer from self-polymerizing in that container during transportation. Inhibitor is consumed over time. So these are known as time-sensitive materials too. Once you package them in that container and you put the inhibitor in them, they have a certain time frame on that inhibitor or it runs out. It's like chlorine in a swimming pool. It gets used up doing its job. It's consumed. And you have to add more chlorine to your swimming pool, right? So that's the same kind of concept here. Now, the inhibitors are consumed faster at higher temperatures. And it can be consumed if the monomer becomes contaminated also. Addition of the inhibitors of a different type, short stop inhibitors to a vessel containing a polymerizing material is often also the primary way in which we de-escalate the potential transportation emergency of them polymerizing.
And temperature, pressure, contamination, these aren't just variables, they're triggers. Let's dig a little deeper into how they influence polymerization. Keith, how does temperature, pressure, or contamination influence the likelihood of spontaneous polymerization during transport or storage, and how are monomers commonly shipped?
We need temperature to help get the chemical reaction started. So if we increase the temperature, that's going to help to start that chemical reaction. Once the polymerization reaction is started, it just keeps producing more heat. As I mentioned, it's exothermic, so it produces more heat. The more heat it produces, the faster it moves. And it's the same with pressure. As we're increasing that temperature, we're also increasing the pressure. And as we increase the pressure, we're heating up the chemicals in the container more, and that just moves the reaction along. So the idea that it keeps moving, it's self-propagating at that point. Now, the contamination is an interesting one. Many polymerization reactions are kicked off or starting using chemicals we call initiators. Organic peroxides are a very common form of initiator. Initiators are highly reactive molecules called free radicals. And these free radicals want to break chemical bonds. So they're in there looking for bonds to break. When they do that and they break bonds, they generate heat. And when they generate that heat and break bonds, they also produce more free radicals. So again, it's that self-propagation. And this really gets the polymerization reaction rolling. When you think about some common contaminants, we can have things like oxygen or rust or solvents. All of them can generate free radicals in the container and kick off this unintended polymerization reaction. So when we ship monomers, we ship them under different conditions, but conditions that have been defined to minimize the amount of heat generated and minimize the amount of free radicals generated. And that enables us to ship them without having those uncontrolled polymerization reactions. Peter mentioned that before about the inhibitors. Inhibitors are in there and they're taking up the free radicals so that we don't kick off a polymerization reaction. The important thing to remember with all this is that those uncontrolled reactions have the potential to release a lot of energy. And it's hard for us to predict when that energy is going to be released and how much energy is going to be released. So responders, we can protect ourselves from solids and vapors. We can protect ourselves from corrosives and toxics, but we cannot protect ourselves from energy, especially when we don't know when the energy is going to be released and how much energy is going to be released.
To Keith's point, reactions are an exponential function of temperature. And at ambient temperatures, rates generally triple for every 18 degrees F, or other parts of the world, it'd be 10 Celsius increase in temperature. So if a reaction takes 3 hours to go from 86 degrees Fahrenheit to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, you can expect it will take an hour for them to get to 122 degrees Fahrenheit. And then in 20 minutes, it will be at 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And in 6 minutes, 158 degrees Fahrenheit. This is why with these materials, early recognition and early action is critical before they get to a point of no return where you're not going to stop the reaction. Similarly, inhibitor reactions are exponential functions of temperatures as well. If you have a monomer that undergoes self-polymerization, it has enough inhibitor to last for 1 year at 86 F, then at 140 degrees F, it will only likely last for a couple weeks. And at 194 F, the inhibitor will only last an hour or two. So you can see how the temperatures really eat up and decrease the inhibitor.
So the big message and the key takeaway from both of you seems to be that polymerization is exothermic and produces heat. Pete, what does this mean for first responders?
I think Keith touched on this. Temperature and pressure, they go hand in hand. If we raise the temperature in a container, in a vessel, in a rail car, an over-the-road trailer, of course, the pressure in that headspace is going to increase as well. In an emergency with these monomers, if responders can find a way to lower the temperature of the material in the container, then the pressure inside that container will decrease. But you have to do it carefully, right? Because you don't know at what stage that reaction is at that current time. So we call them vital signs of that container, if at all possible from a distance, recording the temperature and pressure of that container, the temperature of the material inside is to our advantage. It'll give us data that we can work with reactive chemists from that shipper company or other reactive chemists to confirm if there's time to mitigate that reaction. And that means to try to slow down the reaction and control it, and maybe that container will hold and won't come apart on you. That can be an appropriate action, but again, you have to be very prudent and cautious as you don't know what state that reaction is in until you get the temperature of the material inside. And some containers that can be difficult, right? Because some have jackets on them with insulation. So getting the temperature of the container and the material inside could be difficult. Other than that, it might call for keep people away at the isolation distances for that material and evacuate that area until you can get some data. And if it's not safe to get data, then you keep people away. One thing you have to remember is that many common monomers are liquids, and the products that they form, we've been talking here today, is solids, a lot of them. They're polymers. Therefore, a transportation vessel that is reacting, your pressure relief device is going off, it could stop all of a sudden, and it might give you a false sense of security that pressure relief device did its job and it reseated. However, with these monomers, we have to remember that what a monomer is making is very hot and molten, and it's turning into a solid. So it could have just plugged that pressure relief device on you, and then there's no way to relieve that pressure. Anything to add there, Keith?
Pete, I think you covered it well. That whole idea about the pressure relief dice is critical. That is the main safety component for keeping these vessels safe. And we always have to assume if there's a reaction going on, it could be getting plugged up, as you said, and may not be functioning properly.
And Keith, since we're talking about a monomer that could start polymerizing during transport or storage, how do responders or industry professionals intervene? Can you also explain the concept of short stop inhibitors and how they're used during an emergency?
Sure, Erica. If we think that there may be an uncontrolled polymerization reaction beginning or happening, we want to try and shut down that reaction as fast as possible. Stop that heat generation, stop the buildup of pressure, shut down those free radicals. So if we know that the stabilizer has been used up, then we know that there's no more chemical left inside the tank to soak up those free radicals, and therefore the reaction will continue. So short stopping is a term in the industry, and it's when we go in there and we intentionally terminate the reaction before all the monomers get consumed. So we'll have some monomers left, some polymers. And short stop inhibitors are just like the inhibitors we use when we ship them. And there's different types of short stop inhibitors, but mainly they're free radical scavengers. They'll go in there and they'll soak up all the free radicals, and that will shut down the continuing polymerization reaction. So they deactivate the free radicals essentially. And this effectively halts the growth of the polymer and shuts down the reaction. So when we short stop an uncontrolled polymerization reaction, involves a lot of experience and expertise. Pete and I have talked about these reactions many times over the years, and there's always something I learn when I talk to Pete. So there's a lot of experience and a lot of expertise that the response team needs to consult. They need to talk about the conditions of reaction. They need to think about what's going to happen next. And then if the decision is made to short stop it, we will add some type of short stop inhibitor to the container and shut down that uncontrolled reaction.
And you've both mentioned spotting this runaway reaction is critical and can mean the difference between control and catastrophe. Let's talk a little bit more in depth about what to look for. Keith, how can first responders identify the signs of a runaway reaction in the field? Are there visual, thermal, or chemical indicators that they can recognize?
Absolutely. So some of the visual signs of increasing heat inside the container are things like bulging due to a pressure buildup inside the container. Maybe there's vapor or steam coming out of the closures or couplings or gaskets due to that pressure inside, dislodging the gasket. There could actually be paint melting or burning off the outside of the container due to the intense heat inside the container. Some of those thermal signs that there's that exothermic reaction is that rising temperature. So besides the visual signs, we want to monitor the temperature, as Pete mentioned before. So responders can use a thermal imaging camera. A thermal imaging camera is great to get a good overall heat picture of the vessel and watch the heat change. We could also use a heat gun focused on a certain area of the tank and watch the change in heat over time. We could also monitor pressure gauges or temperature gauges if the reactor or the container has a temperature or pressure gauge. And then those chemical signs of increasing exothermic reaction, that's going to be that vapor production. As the reaction's going, it's producing heat, it's producing pressure. It's also allowing more vapors to be produced. And as more vapors get produced, you're increasing the vapor pressure inside the tank. Plus the product being produced could also increase that pressure. So as we get that increasing tank pressure, then we're going to want to monitor that. So we'll look for that increasing tank pressure. That's a little harder to monitor unless there's a pressure gauge on the tank. So that's why we look for those other signs and indicators that there's a pressure increase.
And these aren't just theoretical risks. We should look at some real-world incidents that show what happens when polymerization goes unchecked. These reactions, as we've mentioned, can be exothermic and violent. Pete, how about you start? What are some real-world examples that you've seen of these types of incidents?
Thank you for asking that question, Erica. There's a few that I have, and then Keith can take you through some examples of real-world incidences. The first one I'll start with is in 2019. There was a chemical tanker on the docks. It was by ship. It was in Korea. On board that tanker was styrene monomer. And what had happened with this one that they didn't realize was going to be an issue was this container was by another container of material that needed to be heated. So they were heating that material up. They were keeping it hot. Well, the styrene monomer tank was right next to it. So that heat transference on that ship went right to the styrene monomer container. It was a catastrophic failure, and the material got out, and all it had to do, if you know styrene, is find an ignition source. And it did, and resulted in a catastrophic explosion on that ship. The inhibitor in that instance was TBC. That's the one that you use for styrene monomer usually. And that heat being that close to that container really decreased the effectiveness of that inhibitor, resulting in that explosion. There's another one with acrylic acid drum explosion. This is kind of an opposite, and we didn't talk about this too much, but in Japan, and this happened in 1969, there was stainless steel drum of acrylic acid. The lid blew off it and the material got out. There was an explosion. And with this factory, it was a 4-floor factory. And that one drum exploding collapsed that factory building. What happened in this instance was the material in there was frozen. It was solidified. They had to heat it up. Now, one thing maybe we didn't touch on too much, when you heat up a monomer that's frozen, you have to do it by strict procedures and very carefully and follow those procedures verbatim. And if you do it wrong, you can result in a catastrophic failure. Now, shipment over the road with this, we've had it in my company where we've had a call from carriers that the product was frozen. And that's fine until it gets to its destination where they have to heat it up to offload the material. That's where it becomes the danger that if you don't do it right, it can result in a bad day. Then there was an incident in 2012. This was on a ship on the seas, and while en route, it was an ISO container, and it was a catastrophic failure explosion that devastated the middle of the ship, and the ship listed. The ship did not sink, and they got it towed into the dock. But this happened, it was divinyl benzene, DVB. This happened, they surmise, because the DVB in the containers was left too long waiting to get on the ship in the summer heat of the temperatures in Louisiana. And this significantly broke down the effectiveness of the inhibitor. So with those few examples, I will kick it to Keith, who can talk about even more.
Great examples, Pete. Let me add a few more to that. There was a MAA, or methacrylic acid railcar rupture in Deer Park, Texas in the 80s. And what they had there was they had a railcar of MAA, and there was an unintended contaminant basically in the railcar, and they didn't know that it was there. It was generated by another reaction inside the railcar. It was a contaminant secondary to another reaction, and that kicked off the polymerization reaction. The folks on site recognized the issue, and they saw the relief valve go off. They recognized the issue. They were monitoring the temperature. They were able to safely move the rail car off-site to a more remote location of the plant. But the resulting polymerization reaction that happened caused stress cracks in the rail car and tears and a serious overpressurization of the rail car. And when you look at videos from that overpressurization, you'll see the polymer, and as Pete was talking about before, it goes from a liquid to a solid. In this case, it was a big, fluffy, but hard solid, almost like the foam you'd spray out of a can to fill the crack in a wall. It just keeps expanding and expanding, and that's what happened, and it caused the cracks in the rail car, and it caused the overpressurization. And then I could also share a couple that I've been on myself. We once had a reactor which we charged with ethylene oxide. Ethylene oxide is a monomer. It's highly flammable. It's highly toxic. It's used to link other molecules to polymers to, in essence, cross-link or make chains of polymers, I should say. We added the ethylene oxide to the reactor, and as the reaction started, there was a seal failure on the agitator, the part that stirs the reaction. When the seal failure happened, the agitator shut down, and we had a problem with the cooling system with that, and there was gases leaking out of it. Ethylene oxide is normally a liquid under pressure, but in the reactor, it's going to be a vapor at that point. With that seal failure, we were leaking a flammable vapor out, which was toxic into the process area. So whenever you're faced with these, something we haven't talked about is there's really three things you can do, right? You could take no action. You could just let it run its course. You could take some defensive actions, such as putting water on it to cool it down, monitoring the temperature, things like that. Or you can take offensive actions, what we were talking about before, where we go in and quench it or shortstop it. So in this case, we use lots of water to take away some of the heat and to also lower the vapors, to disperse and suppress the vapors. Used air monitoring to make sure the atmosphere was okay to enter, and then went in there and had the fire department go in and quench or shortstop the reaction, putting an end to it. Those decisions, as Pete talked about before, they take a lot before those decisions are made. We have a lot of factors to consider. We have to think about what may happen, besides what is happening, what may happen, and then decide how we're going to mitigate it. Then another one, it occurred, we had butyl acrylate intermediate bulk containers, or IBC, so plastic containers with those metal frames around them. And the butyl acrylate was polymerizing inside of the totes, and they were in an outside storage area. So as they were polymerizing, they were generating a lot of heat, which was actually melting the totes and making it worse because now the reaction was spilling out of the container onto the ground. And butyl acrylate has a very irritating odor as well as being very flammable. At that point, in conjunction with the fire department and the hazmat team, we decided that we weren't going to take an offensive action because we were having that container failure. We decided to do more defensive, so we flowed a lot of water on it to cool the IBCs, and water will be effective in cooling a plastic IBC. We let it cool a bit, and we let the reaction slowly run its course. I hope that Pete and I have illustrated these are challenging incidents and require that you really get the right technical expertise together and you make some good, solid, strategic and tactical decisions.
Thank you both for sharing those incidents. It's so critical for first responders to learn from past incidents, and knowing these risks is one thing, but also being prepared is another. Let's talk a little about protective gear and protocol. Keith, are there specific PPE or response protocols that should be followed when dealing with these reactive monomers?
I think some basics. First of all, on PPE, there's no PPE to protect you from the energy. So we always have to be thinking about that uncontrolled release of energy. Some never do's, I would say, is never touch or move a bulging drum or container. Never get too close to any container under pressure. And never stand downwind or in the line of fire of a pressure relief device. You never know when that pressure relief device is going to activate, and you don't want to be downwind or in the line of fire of it. I think some to-dos we've mentioned a few times, air metering, right? Use your multi-gas meter to continue to measure for combustible gases or the LEL. Use your photoionization detector to measure for toxics. Keep monitoring that temperature, both with your thermal imaging camera as well as a temperature gun or a temperature probe that you can use to get a little finer pinpoint measurement of the temperature. Pressure gauges are available, monitor the pressure. And for PPE, protect against the flammables, the toxic, always wear your SCBA, no matter whether it's turnout gear or chemical protective clothing. Be careful of that energy release. There was a gentleman back in the 70s named Ludwig Benner, and he came up with a model called the General Hazardous Materials Behavior Model. The model's been around for a long time, but really I think it's a model that every hazmat professional needs to be familiar with. And basically what it says is you look at the container, you try to understand the stresses on the container, you do your best to predict how the container would fail, and then if it fails, what type of release of product will occur, how will that release disperse, who is that release going to contact, and what harm could it do when it contacts people or even other buildings? And you use that to try and predict what's going on inside the vessel as well as where it may go. And you can use that as the basis for choosing your PPE and making sound strategic and tactical decisions.
Let's wrap up with some guidance on training and resources. Keith, what training or resources would you recommend for hazmat teams to stay current on these hazards and mitigation techniques?
In terms of training and resources, the first is you need to understand the chemistry of monomers, polymers, initiators, inhibitors. So having a good solid background in hazmat chemistry, especially as it pertains to things like monomers and oxidizers, organic peroxides, is good for any hazmat technician. Take training on unstable and reactive chemicals such as monomers, organic peroxides, oxidizers, chemicals like that. Obviously, listen to podcasts like this, listen to webinars, attend hazmat conferences. There's a lot of folks who share experiences like Peter and I have shared today. And then make use of training resources like the ones found on transcare.com. I'm a big fan of the Seconds Counts videos, and I use those in a lot of my training. So that'd be my advice.
And Pete, any additional training that your organization provides first responders that you might want to mention?
We're really heavily into the TransCare training program. We just got finished with TransCare training with the Chlorine Institute in Detroit, Michigan. But we'll come to your fire departments on your night meetings, on your weekend meetings. We have that kind of commitment in the area that we operate all our sites throughout the United States and the globe. We just have to know what you need in our area that we operate, and we'll help get it to you. We've done from chlorine to ammonia to this topic, monomers and inhibitors, and much more. Partnered with the rail industry, brought rail safety and everything about the railroads and the rail cars, how they're built, what to know about them to your area. For myself, you can reach out to me and we can provide it for you if you're in an area where we operate.
Thank you both so much for reviewing those training resources, being such supporters of TransCare. And it's good for first responders to know that there is training on this topic and a wealth of other hazmat-related topics through TransCare and through chemical manufacturers themselves. That wraps up today's episode of Reactive by Nature. We've explored the volatile world of monomers, the stabilizing power of polymers, and the critical role first responders play in keeping communities safe. A huge thank you to our guests, Keith Silverman and Pete Kirk, for sharing your expertise and insights. We really, truly appreciate your time today and your investment in the TransCare program. If you found this episode helpful, be sure to subscribe and share it with your team. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and remember, chemistry doesn't wait, and neither should you.